No, sorry. Yeah, I like that. It's really good. Like a lot of good knowledge about yeah. Yeah, thank you guys. Wow. It's you there. Yeah. Let's talk. Because they need artists like me to push. Like I just built a whole film my own personal assistant. Because I'm trying to build black business.
Roundtable, and this is part of our Question Bridge Black Males exhibition at the Mary Porter Sesnon Art Gallery. And my name is Shelby Graham. I'm the gallery director. And this is the first time we've done an event at Oaks, so let's give it up for Oaks. Thank you for this wonderful, this new venue. It's kind of fun to walk around the Redwoods and get a different view of the ocean over here. It's nice. First of all, I'm going to step out of the way very shortly, but I do want to offer a few thank yous. So first of all, a big thank you to John Weber and the Institute of Arts and Sciences. This is a partnership, a collaboration to bring Question Bridge to Santa Cruz. So thank you for the Institute, and I'll be thanking lots of people, so hold your applause. Also a big thank you to our gallery manager at the Sesnon Gallery, Ann Altstad. She made this gallery at the Sesnon come alive, and all the technical aspects were beautiful, and then here tonight she helped set all this up. So thank you, Ann. Also thank you to all the IAS staff, Rachel Nelson, Alex Moore, Axel Boyer, and Axel was the one who was instrumental in bringing over 500 students really to the gallery through outreaching to faculty members, and we had ongoing classes coming in and having critical discussions in the gallery. So that was really fabulous. Also the IAS interns, Jocelyn and Kathleen, and then of course our fabulous Sesnon interns, Davidra Jackson right here, she's a Chancellor's undergraduate intern, Marco Ahumada, who's a professional career intern, and then we have Talia, who's been a fabulous Charles Griffin Farr intern. Then we have Bryant Hernandez, and Bryant is part of the MOC, Men of Color intern, and we have a whole group here. And Emily Goodmanson is a history of art and visual culture intern. Also, I want to just thank the Arts Division and our new interim Dean of the Arts, Edward Warburton, and thank you, Ted, thank you for being here. And then our sponsors, Arts Division, Porter College, the Nyan McAvoy Family Trust, Pat and Roland Rubley, all these folks who support the IAS and Sesnon programming. We couldn't do it without the support, so thanks, and please donate to the arts, remember that. Now I'm going to just tell you quickly about the Question Bridge. Chris Johnson, who originated this project, is sorry to say that he could not be here tonight from Oakland, so we were all sad. And then I realized that Chris gave us the tools to carry on this program on a local level and carry on what Question Bridge brought about. So I'm sad that he can't be here because he's on his way to North Carolina to introduce Question Bridge to the Charlotte school system. So it's really great. Come on in, there's lots of chairs. So anyway, Chris Johnson is a photographer, video artist, and professor of art at the CCA, California College of the Arts in Oakland and San Francisco. And he originated this project, and it started out, it was called Question Bridge Black Communities. And so it was really a broad topic. Like, he wanted Black communities to talk to each other. And then he had a rock star arts graduate student named Hank Willis Thomas who came along and said, hey, let's work on this together and focus on Black males and in America, and let's do a bigger project. And so he got together with Hank Willis Thomas, Bayete Ross Smith, and Camille Sinclair, and that they produced what you've been watching, this 5-channel video of interviews of 150 Black men asking each other questions across the United States. So in addition to all this, Chris Johnson really wanted to create a live public roundtable. He said, you know, there's one thing to go and interview people and have people talk video to video, but let's have a real discussion with people and on a local level. So that's what we're doing here tonight. And I just wanted to say briefly that Question Bridge is on permanent display at several locations, and the closest one is at the Oakland Art Museum. So if you're ever up in Oakland and want to see the whole Question Bridge Black Males, you can go to Oakland Museum of California. It's also at the Smithsonian, you know, so there's another great venue to go to and see it. So I think I'll just end it there, except I do want to tell a story about, just briefly, Jesse Williams, who's one of the actors who's in this Question Bridge. He said that once he became an actor and had the face of the media, he was involved in Question Bridge, he realized he had a role to play in portraying black males in cinema and TV. So anyway, it's really cool how this project has affected a lot of people. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play a 2-minute trailer, and then I'm going to introduce Abel Rasson, who's going to lead the whole panel. So I think that that'll work, and then everyone's going to get up here. So go ahead, you can play the trailer. Eritrea, East Africa, and at age 11, Abel, alongside his family, migrated to San Leandro, California, and the value of education was ingrained in his upbringing that Abel acquired his bachelor's degree in global economics last year from UCSC, and he's currently the coordinator of the EOP, Educational Opportunity Programs, and Men of Color program here at UCSC. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you, Shelby, for having me be part of the event. So moving forward, briefly, I'll explain our panelists and we'll just dive in straight to the conversation since we're time limited. So first, I want to start off with introducing Dr. David Anthony III. He is a professor of African history here at UC Santa Cruz. He was born in New York City. He graduated from New York University and earned his master's and PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's taught at Coppin State University, College, now University, the University of Oregon, and since 1988, the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's done fieldwork in Tanzania, Lesotho, and South Africa. Journals of publication include African Studies Review, Social Sciences Submission, Journal of Religion in Africa, Journal of Anglican Studies, among others. Anthony authored Max Yergin, Race, Man, Internationalist, and Cold Warrior. Dr. David Anthony's focus on research includes African and African American history, art, music, literature, and cinema, Eastern and Southern Africa, African languages, Indian Ocean world, African and African American linkages, Islamic civilization, African diaspora studies, and world history. Dr. David Anthony is also co-director of the Howard University Research Project, African American Historical Linkage with South Africa. So please help me introduce you. Next, I have Mr. J.J. Porter. He's been a member of the African American Council of Santa Cruz County, Second Saturday, and the NAACP. He has been active in local theater groups, including Soquel Creek Community Theater, the African American Theater Arts Troupe, ATAP, and Aboki Productions. He recently published his first novel, Blood Nexus. And next, I have Mr. Drew Glover. He's a 34-year-old and born and raised in Santa Cruz, California. Born into a single-parent family, Drew is the son of a single white mother, a cancer survivor, and an advocate for social and environmental justice. Being born in a white family in a white community, Drew has learned the hard way what other young people of color experience in a community that does not look like them, especially here in Santa Cruz, a city blinded by its own liberalism. We have yet to create a public voice of acknowledging our true history and realities of exclusion and discrimination. Drew graduated in 2003 as the first African-American senior class president at Harvard High School, but it wasn't until he studied sociology at Cabrillo College that he gained the knowledge and perspective to be able to name his experience with local oppression. This insight has given him the tools and motivation to help Santa Cruz move towards its goals of diversity and nonviolence, while a lifetime of immersion in white society has allowed him to develop the exposure to the culture needed to make him an excellent bridge builder. Drew works at the Resource Center for Nonviolence, is the executive director of Project Pollinet, and now sits as one of the first Black City Council members of the Santa Cruz City Council, where he is fighting for equity and representation for the most vulnerable among us. I would like to introduce Jason Harper. He's from Hayward, California, and is also a transfer student here at UCSC. Jason transferred to UC Santa Cruz 6 months ago from Chabot Community College. Jason is currently majoring in computational math, and he plans to attend graduate school for computer science. He is currently deciding on his next step for graduate school. A few other things about Jason is that he is a first-generation college student and likes to do computer animation in his spare time. And lastly, I would like to introduce Najee Wilcox. He was born and raised in New York. He's currently a senior majoring in philosophy. He will graduate this quarter, actually, and he has plans to attending law school in the near future. He's also one of the interns for Men of Color. So, please. So moving forward for the dialogue, we kind of just opened it up and among the panelists and start with a question, and as we ask each other, also we're gonna open it up to the space and people could ask and go from there. So one of the questions that I kind of stuck onto while I was watching the video earlier was the youngsters asking the elders, why didn't y'all leave us a blueprint? And if y'all felt like y'all did leave us a blueprint, well, what was it? And I kind of just want to start off asking that question.
The qualification for answering this question is having sufficient snow in the mountains. So in Tanzania, there is this beautiful mountain. It's called Kilimanjaro. It has two peaks, Kibo and Mawenzi. You know, the question is a very, very significant question, and I'm very glad that it was asked. It is a question that every generation asks. It's not a new question. And to step outside of the African-derived tradition, to think about something that I heard and read while I was studying at another point, a man by the name of Lev Davidovich Bronstein, who is known as Leon Trotsky, said, each generation excommunicates its ancestors. Now that's kind of scary. It's scary if you have also come to understand something about the value of elderhood, of being an elder. But sometimes we talk about that more than practice it. And often the intergenerational dialogue is lacking, and I think that that's what that question speaks to. A lot of people who feel a sense of disconnection with other generations. And I think it comes back to mentoring, both formally and informally. And I think many of us have had these experiences of having been mentored, but there are many people who have not. And often that creates both opportunities and crises. I was provost of this college for 6 years. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to be able to intervene in some people's lives in ways that exceeded the potential of the classroom. Because by and large, when you are in a classroom, even if people get to know you, they generally get to know you up to a point. But if you are a provost in a college, then you will find that people will talk to you about things that they will not often talk to teachers about, and sometimes not even their parents. And so I found that I was thrust into a role of mentorship that was avuncular. It was like an uncle. And I mean this in the positive sense. If you have an experience of a good uncle, some people have experience of bad uncles. But I'm trying to channel the good uncle right now. And sometimes I would be asked to be the good uncle for someone who was not in communication with or not in a good relationship with his father, and who would ask me questions that in other circumstances might have been asked of that father. And there were references to this at different points as well in some of the conversations and some of the questions that were raised. So that's a long way around addressing, contextualizing the question. And I do agree with the aspiration of leaving the blueprint. But it is a blueprint. And as a blueprint, you do have to find it. And you do have to figure out how you can implement the blueprint. So with the blueprint, you also have to have the wherewithal, and you have to have the materials, and you have to have the time to take the blueprint and turn it into something practical. When it comes to fatherhood, for example, something that I've been blessed to experience, I had models in my father and in my paternal grandfather, because my maternal grandfather had transitioned long before I could really get to know him. But every time one moves into a position of responsibility, one is doing it to some degree on one's own. If you have children, they're your children, but even a succession of children, even 2 or 3 children, they're not the same. So your experiences in determining what it is that you're going to try to impart can be very different depending upon when, where, and with whom you're dealing. And it's always a two-way street. That is to say, it's not just I talk, you listen. It's that we communicate. And this is the issue. This is a conversation. And it's the conversation that in any tradition has a sacred quality. If you go to Lesotho, where I was teaching and living right before coming here, there is a gathering of elders that they call lechokla. Lechokla. It's a council. And you'll find councils all over Africa. Okay? And it's very, very important to understand one's relationship to that council. So we are in a council right now, and we have an opportunity by being in a council to reach more of ourselves, not just as individuals, but in relationship and in council. And I think that's a place to start this.
Hi, I'm J.J. Porter, and I guess we're talking about a blueprint that I might have got from my parents. Well, when I was in high school, I remember I went to a convention with Key Club, and we were going to be in Washington, D.C. And my mother said to me, now watch out where you go. Don't go any place where people might not want you. Now this was in 1961. That was my blueprint. I just didn't grow up with that. I don't know how to put it. Even in high school, there was a group that came from UC Berkeley, and they were studying race relations. And my name kept coming up because I seemed to get along with white people as well as I did with black people. It wasn't any, I was just myself. But I just didn't think about it, which in some cases, like I had taken college prep courses, I was getting A's and B's in math, and I wanted to go ahead and major in math. I got one advice from my counselor in high school, and that was to take more shop classes. The Dean of Boys, who had played for the Detroit Lions and was a hero of the athletes, told me, Jim, you don't want to go into math, you need to go into something else. I didn't realize at the time that was because of my race. And I realized later in life many other things have been things that I came up against that are racial. But it's just me. I don't know if it's not in me, I'm just not that kind of person. I don't know why it's like that. I mean, all of my wives have been white. I've been in Santa Cruz 50 years, with mostly a white population. To be honest with you, sometimes people have to point out to me. I was trying to rent a room with this friend, and the guy says, oh no, we wanted to rent to students. And he just said, well, what makes you think we're not students? It didn't even occur to me until he said that. Anyway, if you talk about a blueprint from my parents, and let me just apologize in advance. I have lost 2 pair of hearing aids. I need hearing aids. So if you want to ask me anything, you got to speak up. That's all I have to say.
Can I say something? Thinking about this question made my mind go in a lot of different places. To begin with, I think my first blueprint I got was from my mom, who did the best that she could. I was raised here in Santa Cruz with a white family. So I had my mom teaching me about feminism and multiculturalism because she was a student here when I was a kid, and she intentionally graduated in multiculturalism to try to be able to give me that exposure, or at least that understanding, being a mixed race kid in Santa Cruz. I was a part of Second Saturday when I was 8 years old, with Newbert Floyd and everything. We used to meet down at the London Nelson Center. But it wasn't really until I got into college and took my first sociology class, and then it wasn't until I really started studying the civil rights movement in general before I really understood myself. And it really wasn't until I got into Selma physically, and going into Selma, Alabama, and spending a week there during the historic Jubilee and meeting all of the foot soldiers and the people that were involved in the civil rights struggle then. Hey, he's been to Selma with me right there, Santiago. But something that made me giggle inside while I was listening to us talk is when I started studying the civil rights movement, and when I started studying specifically Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he actually gave a speech they called Your Life's Blueprint. So a lot of this information, especially because that piece, Your Life's Blueprint, is a speech he gave at a junior high school, I think a couple months before he was assassinated. But the idea of the adequate education of black males into our history and the personification of black leaders in mainstream culture, because the Dr. King that we're taught about in schools is the sanitized, whitewashed version of Dr. King. If we all grew up learning the true message of Dr. King, the relationship he could have had with Malcolm X, the realities of the Black Panther Party, that's the blueprint that they left for us. But it's been buried under layers of just disempowered educational systems that are meant to keep us down. And there's a question in the piece about, you know you're in a system that's meant to keep you down. That's not just the criminal justice system. It is also the education system, it's the housing system, it's the political system. So the blueprint is there for us. We just have to really dig. And it's being inspired at a young enough age to be able to start digging at that veracity that you need to be able to get the knowledge you need by the time you're an adult and entering into college. Because if I had the knowledge I had now entering into college, I would have been a completely different person and my life might have gone in completely different ways. But I believe in the spirit, and I'm here now because it's where I need to be able to share that knowledge with other people that might not be there yet. So, thank you.
All right, I actually had to write my question down so I wouldn't forget it, but I'm going to try to put this question as delicately as possible. I don't want to play the blame game here or anything, but all right, let me just ask it. So a while ago I spoke with my grandfather and several other elders in my family. Many of them expressed how they ultimately believe we have taken a considerable amount of steps backwards, but I felt as though they have not taken into account that they have constantly reinforced certain ideologies on us. So my question is, are we to blame for this retraction, or are the elders? Moreover, what can we do to ensure that we make the necessary advancements in the future?
That's a hard question. I like that you opened it with not wanting to play the blame game. It's tricky because we've been struggling for a long time, hundreds and hundreds of years, being held down by the system that has been actively working since slavery to dehumanize us, to make us work against ourselves, or to betray each other in our own sense of survival. So the amount of progress that was able to be made before our time was monumental, but the world shifted, especially in the 70s and 80s, especially around the United States, and the way that they were able to disenfranchise the black communities. So I think that it's a combination of systemic oppression and all of these different factors on top of the stress felt by the families that are having to deal with the influx of drugs into communities that are brought in by outside actors, from the disenfranchisement of black entrepreneurs and the abilities for people to gain wealth and generational wealth, Jim Crow laws, all of those kinds of things that came after the voting rights or the desegregation happened, all the stuff that happened before the voting rights and civil rights movement. I've been watching that show Underground. You watch Underground?
I can't say that I've heard.
If any of you have not seen Underground on Hulu, you should watch Underground. It's really, really intense, but it gives you a really raw feel of how much energy during slavery went into the dehumanization of people to make them feel like they're not worth something. And then also, if you take into consideration, like use Selma, for example, I'm probably always gonna draw back to that, is Selma was the hotbed of voting rights activism during the 1960s, late 60s. I mean, that's the historic march that caused the president to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but it now is facing all kinds of socioeconomic positions or issues. The question is that because the elders abandoned the youth, or is it because the youth abandoned the elders? The people that are on the ground in Selma right now say that the reason why it is the way it is because it's been used as a case study of how white supremacist power can gum into a community that is powerful and united and slowly whittle away at it generation by generation until now the people are killing each other and fighting over scraps. So I don't think that anyone is to blame except for the white supremacist power structure.
Sing it.
I think it's a good question. I think, as you were mentioning it, I was thinking about my paternal grandfather. And, you know, the first thing we have to always remember is that you can only judge a person within their time. My paternal grandfather was born in the last decade of the 19th century. He was in World War I, and he lived into the 1980s, which is pretty incredible for somebody who was gassed in France and who was a truck driver in Jersey City. He was hard, he was rough and tough. He was very old school, and he was very unsparing in his criticism of other black people. But he was also a very loving grandfather, very nurturing, very supporting. And so I think what happens is that every one of us, just like culture, is a mix. And we are a mix of positive and negative qualities. Another thing to keep in mind is that until very recently, anyone who was of African descent, who grew up in the United States, regardless of what part of the country they grew up in what was a segregated society. And a segregated society forced upon you certain kinds of modes of behaving and thinking. And one of those modes was a sense of the collective. Now, I don't want to romanticize this. I don't want to say this is, I don't want to be nostalgic about this, because we have also been, because we are so close to one another, the people who, when we explode at the expense often of people who look like us. So we have now to mourn an Eritrean American who has come to a lot of people's attention, people who didn't necessarily know that he was Eritrean American, because they knew him as Nipsey Hussle. And that crabs in the barrel mentality, that pull him down, as they say in West Africa. In other words, someone gets a little bit further up, somebody will pull them down. And that's a practice that unfortunately has been another part of our history for a very long time, and in many places. It's how we got here, you know? At the same time, we need to say, okay, take what you can from that relationship. And it sounds like not all of it was bad. But those parts of it that don't work, or those parts of it that in some respects may reinforce the negativity, may serve to threaten to hold you back, those are the things that you don't need to be defined by. You are the person who defines who you will be. It doesn't mean that we can do anything. There are certain limits. But it does mean that we can do many things, starting with our sense of what it is that we should do and who we are. Respectfully.
So I can't necessarily answer the second question, but before we push past it, I wanted to give my thoughts regarding the first question and touch a little bit on. Oh, sorry. And I wanted to touch as well on some of the things that Dr. Anthony as well as Mr. Glover said. So in the concept of having a blueprint laid, I think Dr. Anthony said something really important, the idea of a blueprint having to be found, and then as well the concept of mentorship that he played into it as well. Within the video, I noticed a lot of the older gentlemen talking in regards to a blueprint being left. We're talking in regards to a blueprint that was left by Dr. King and his movement. And I was born in 1992. I'm right at the tail end of the crack generation. So there's a big gap from the late 60s to 80s and 90s, you know. So this blueprint that was apparently left for those past generations, I'm not completely sure it was necessarily left for me. And then the idea of disenfranchisement that Mr. Glover touched on, the disenfranchisement of the Black community, specifically stemming from the advent of the prison industrial complex, has created a gap in the ability for mentorship, for tutelage. I grew up specifically in New York, and Dr. Anthony would be able to attest to this a little bit better. But there was a point in time, the welfare system in New York City specifically wouldn't allow, there was a no-father clause. The stigma that's in relation to having a Black male within the home, it's not something that extends only to white communities. It's something that specifically within our own community is something that we've really had to struggle with. And I do think the ball has necessarily been dropped to a certain extent. Now, the question that was just asked largely plays into, you know, really where was that ball dropped? Was it dropped by us? Was it dropped by them? I think while I was watching this originally and while I was listening to this questioning, it was really interesting to me to think that we as a people, we've become so disenfranchised to a point in which the generational trauma that each one of these men up here have had to delve with, we haven't necessarily had an opportunity for the most part, especially in the older generations, to deal with it. And the stigma behind mental health, it was much worse in the 60s, 70s, and 80s than it is now. The idea of mental health in the Black community is coming to fruition. It's something that's in the forefront. So I think there was there's a hole, a socio-psychological hole that many older gentlemen may not necessarily know or understand that they have. That I think that blueprint is being passed down, at least to the group of Black men that can. I grew up in a project housing in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York. It's identified as the murder capital of New York. It's top 10 in child poverty. My first project housing I ever grew up in, by the time I was 8, the city had to destroy it because of a rat infestation. So this concept of finding this blueprint that was so supposedly left, I think is one that it's very easy to speak in regards to, but this gap is something that maybe certain aspects of our elders and even my generation as well, we may have a cognitive dissonance when it comes in regards to understanding that maybe this is an issue, this blueprint, you know, it's something that we're looking at it in the wrong way. You know, the idea of Dr. King's blueprint being the blueprint that can necessarily help my generation, I don't necessarily even agree with that concept, you know. I don't want to say it was easier, but in regards to battling racism and things like that, it was much more clear. There's no aspect of technology in the 1960s that now, you know, with the advent of technology and the pushing on of things such as this, racism is developing, you know, it's changing, and the way in which we have to interact with it is changing as well. So I do agree with Dr. Anthony with the idea that many, if not all things you aspire to be and new processes you go through in life, there are processes that you alone you have to delve with, but at the same time, I don't necessarily agree with the concept that throughout the process of understanding and growing throughout these things in your own life, you don't bring someone with you, whether it's a child or whoever it may be, but I think it's necessary that you bring someone with you, and I don't think that was necessarily done with other communities.
If I understand the question, it's are the elders abandoning the youth by not passing on some of their wisdom, or are the youth pulling away from the elders? And I kind of think it's some of both. I am guilty of not giving my son, I guess, a blueprint, or my daughter, or either both my daughters. I've wanted to pass on. I have a spiritual feeling. I feel like I'm a spiritual person, but I don't have the words or I'm not able to communicate with my kids like that. I wish I could, but I didn't, and I do. I feel guilty about it sometimes because I had to put up with so much more than they do, even though, you know, when I came here back in, whenever I came here, 50 years ago, you know, it was a white community basically. There were blacks here, but they weren't out in public. I had a few black friends, but I just never had that ability to pass that on to my children. It was, I don't know if you want to call it just a fault of mine. I can call it that. It's just that I never did and I never tried. So I think in my case I can say that in a way I did. I should have given my children some more of my wisdom, and I didn't. Thank you.
Just one thing really quick, just in response to the brother over here with Dr. King's blueprint not working necessarily for our modern day and time. It's a conversation in the nonviolence world that I run into semi-frequently with people between my age, your age, and even younger that are like, what, nonviolence? That's never going to work. That doesn't make any sense. That's time to think of the past. So it's interesting. I'd love to have a longer conversation about it with you after this, because there's a lot of things I think I could probably learn from you, and ideally vice versa with my conversation. So, right on.
One other thing, just because you mentioned nonviolence, and I know, but when I listened to Dr. Martin Luther on TV speak, when he had the I Have a Dream speech, that's the only leader that has actually brought tears to my eyes. I listened to that speech, and he brought tears to my eyes. Now, there were other groups around that said Dr. King was Uncle Tom, and we should be out there in the streets and fighting. And in retrospect, maybe he could have been a little bit more, I don't want to say violent, but a little bit more active out in the streets. But at the time, my feeling was, that's the way I feel. It's your integrity, not the color of your skin. And I had the fortune to spend 2 years in Nigeria in the Peace Corps. And racism in this country does not compare to tribalism. I mean, I don't want to put down my African brothers, but I was there during the Biafran War, and there were people who said, this country will be no good until every Igbo is dead. I mean, there are probably some people in this country that feel that way, people that want to make America white again. But, we have to measure it on a worldwide scale. It's just, sometimes I feel it's just in human beings. To be prejudiced, I don't want to use the word racist, because to me, racist means you think you're better than me. And of course, there are plenty of people that say, keep them people down. They're just not any good, but I feel myself that you have to judge a person by their integrity. Anyway, that's it.
And Najee, do you have a question maybe you want to bring up?
So I didn't prepare a question previously, but I guess off the top of my head, I can ask our elders. Throughout the process of your life, were there any specific moments or periods in time in which you can identify which allowed you to become the type of man that you are now? And the reason why I ask that is, and also let me take a moment to appreciate Dr. Anthony. I've taken multiple of his courses, and I greatly admire this man. I aspire to be anywhere in the realm of the type of person he is. But on that path that you voyaged, and I've actually spoken with Dr. Anthony in regards to this, in the same way they question, how do you know you love a woman? How do you know what you're aspiring to be, the path you're on, is correct?
You don't, brother. You make many mistakes. My father used to say, everybody makes mistakes, that's why there are erasers on pencils. And I have worn many erasers down. The kind of person that one is always changing. As long as you live, we are becoming, if we have that opportunity. I remember I interviewed the late trumpeter and composer Lee Morgan, and I asked him a question in my interview. I said, well, what does it feel like to be Lee Morgan at this stage of your life? And he looked at me and he said, hey man, you know, I don't think of my life as having stages, you know. Well, in less than 2 years, he was gone. So that was the last stage of his life. And we never know. We never know when that's going to come. We never know how much or how little time we have left. I can say that in some ways, there have been angels that have appeared. There have been mentors. There have been people who have helped me, have opened doors for me, and I remember one of them very, very well. And you probably heard this story before. When I started in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there was a man by the name of Tom Schick, who was a senior graduate student to me. He was, at that time, about to move forward in his career. He was finishing up his dissertation. He had already taught. He had taught at San Francisco State, and he was back in Madison writing a dissertation on the history of African Americans in Liberia. And he was the person who welcomed me when I started graduate school at a very young age. He was also from New York City. So that's my tribal connection. And he said, I want to help you get through here so that these people can respect you. So there was a sort of outward goal in that, you know, understanding that there are others who could determine my future, right? I'm in a program. I want to succeed in this program. In order to succeed in this program, I have to be able to prove myself. So it was a kind of initiation in a way. But he was the person who was going to prepare me for this initiation. And he said, I don't want anything from you, but I want you to understand something. This was done for me when I got here. So I want you to do it for someone else when you have that opportunity. And this is in fact something that came from historically black colleges. Okay? So here we were in a white institution, but we were taking this particular old school adaptation, this particular strategy, and applying it in a situation where it could have the same effect, which is to say, each one teach one. that here someone was going to bring me along. And I've had those experiences in a number of instances, and not always with black folks. You know, my mentors have been my mentors. Sometimes they were other people of African descent, and sometimes they were not. But what matters was that they were my mentors, that they recognized that they had an opportunity to share something with me. And they rose to the occasion. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
It was a very Jedi answer at the end. I really like that. Something that you said really, a couple things actually, but the experience that you had with the person that took you under their wing and supported you and said, hey, you don't owe me anything for this, but do it for someone else. I had that exact same experience, which is what kind of shifted me, gave me the ability, I should say, to shift into community organizing. Was an old professor of mine. I went up to him and said, hey, are you into social justice? He kind of laughed, and turned out he was like this super involved social justice person in Santa Cruz. Dennis Eller, I don't know if you know him. But then he opened up a space for me to live at his spot in Boulder Creek while I started laying the framework for the community organizing that I was doing. And this gets back to the question, how do you know what you're doing is right, or that it's the thing you should be doing? And you know, if you asked me 4 years ago if I was going to be an elected official, I would have said no. If you had asked me 2 or 3 years before that if I was going to be a community organizer, I probably would be like, probably not. If you had asked me 2 or 3 years before that if I was going to be a professional photographer, I would have said, what are you talking about? Like, no way. And if you would have told me 5 years before that I was going to get diagnosed with testicular cancer, then I would have been like, what are you kidding? You're crazy, right? So all of those different things in those experiences sent me on different tracks, which then led me to this point here. And so I find I would imagine it would be exhausting to continually ask myself, am I doing the right thing? Is this what I should be doing? And there was actually a video that a friend of mine posted, because he's been doing Lyft driving for a while now, and he posed the question, what does it mean to be productive? Because is it being productive, using all of your skills and being as generative as possible and as productive as possible and always doing work and always creating something? Or is it spending your time and energy making connections with others, even if it's not for monetary or productive gain, but in building that network and the relationships with each other? And so that posed an interesting question of, what does it mean to be productive in life? Because I could work every day and generate all kinds of stuff, but in the end have no community or no connection. When on the other side, I could end up with nothing financially, but be enriched completely through my connections and my relationships with people and the higher power or the spirit or the universe or whatever you want to call it. So it's definitely an interesting question, but I think if you feel it, and I can't describe the feeling, just like they couldn't describe in the film, what does it mean to know that you found the right woman to be with for the rest of your life? You just feel this sense of positive drive, I guess is the best way, where you wake up in the morning and you're not like, oh, I have to go to work. You wake up in the morning and you're like, all right, what am I gonna do today to change the world? And then kind of take it from there.
So before we open up the dialogue to the greater space, I guess one question that I want to bring up is, Dr. David Anthony, you mentioned it's an African cultural practice to sit as a community and have the dialogue to wait traffic. So what is the question that y'all might have for the younger black men that are sitting on this panel?
The question I would ask is, what do you need to help you on your journey?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear, I can't hear half of what's going on.
The question was, what do you need to help you on your journey?
A good publicist. That's my journey today. I like to write and I like to act, and right now those are the things that I do.
I guess my answer will be fairly brief here. I would just say reassurance is the primary thing for me, and generally just connections. Just generally connections. Reassurance and connections. Those are the two most essential things for me.
I agree completely. I would love some great connections. But other than that, in all honesty, I've thought about this a lot in my own time. And I think that when I look for a mentor, more than anything, I want someone that, when I use the word love, I don't want it to be interpreted incorrectly. In the English language, we only have one word to express love, which is clearly not the proper way to go about expressing yourself. But I want the type of love that comes inherent with tutelage. In my community, I didn't grow up in a type of community that would necessarily facilitate my intellect in a way that would allow for me to see the personalized beauty that me wanting to be intelligent has, that me wanting to help and strive people has. So I personally believe when you have that type of tutelage with someone, there's an inherent sense of love that comes within it. And most black men in my generation, we haven't necessarily experienced that type of love. And I don't mean it from a standpoint of like, oh, I want you to see me and be so jubilant and overzealous with love or anything like that. I mean in the terms of when I speak with Dr. Anthony, you know, when I speak with other people that I view as mentors, the way in which you break down things, I don't want them to be from a purely empirical point in which, okay, this happened, so I know this works. The part of myself that I don't allow to come to the forefront because mental health and talking about mental or psychological implications in our community is so sparse. I want to see from an older, stronger black man that I aspire to be that side of myself can be something that can strengthen me. So more than anything, that's what I look for.
I'm still thinking about what do I need. Sometimes you don't know what you need, or sometimes you're not sure about what you need. But I think as far as guidance and as far as the blueprint we're talking about, Dr. David Anthony, hearing you say, I have a lot of those erasers. I make mistakes all the time. I think I needed to hear that, just because yes, there is a pressure of trying to figure your life out, being young, being black, and being a black male sometimes. Yes, there's a pressure of don't be a stat, be something different, be a leader. And along that journey, you're making a lot of mistakes. You don't know what that look like sometimes, or you do, or you try to follow that. That might not be the right way to go about things. So I think what I need is just presence of, just realness of leaders that could share their vulnerability and their experience in a raw form and not in a very romanticized or not shaped up form, but just tell how it is. And I think that's what I need at this point.
Go ahead.
While it's fresh, you got it? You sure?
Huh?
While it's fresh.
I'm gonna do it, yeah, I'll forget. All right, I just have to say one thing about my path, and started off in high school with the Dean of Boys turning me away from math. Years later, when I went back to Cabrillo and I took a math class, and they say you only have to do every odd question. I would do every one. And then I'd go back and do them again just because I love doing it. And that's one thing that I'm really sorry about, is that I didn't follow that. But then also, part of what I am today is because I went to jail. Sales of marijuana, that changed. I was a student teacher. As a matter of fact, I was a student teacher here. And then I got busted, and that kind of changed my whole life. It took 20 years, probably 5 years of appealing to the Department of the DOD, whatever, trying to get my teaching credentials, which I eventually did. But my path changed because what they say, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. Well, I did the crime, And so I had to do the time. And of course, that really affected how my life has turned out today. And I get pissed off at my lawyer because he should have beat it.
Something that really stuck out to me that you mentioned is vulnerability. I think that's super huge, especially in elders, especially elder males that are Black, is being open to that vulnerability and being willing to show that with the people they're working with. That sets a example for the next generation to be even more comfortable with that vulnerability, because that's something that the toxic masculinity in general is a cancer of our society, but especially of Black males, and needing to show that they're tough and that they're hard and all these other kinds of stereotypes that are put onto me. And I was raised in a white family by a white feminist mom, so I was told to cry and, you know, express yourself. So from people coming from other backgrounds or other family structures, especially in the Black community where that's not nearly as acceptable, and at least in the relationships with Black families that I've had, having that be a thing. And then as far as the love goes, something that helped me better to define and understand love is the Greek ways of expressing love. So there's eros, which is that romantic filio infatuation love, but then there's philia, which is the brotherly love, kind of like a give and take kind of thing. I think that's more what you're referring to with the tutelage, and then also then agape, which is the understanding of that universal love. So knowing those three different levels and the different intensities of them, to have philia with your elder mentors and have that sense of connection of each giving and learning and taking and pulling and pushing each other, I think is incredibly important. So being there when things get rough, like right now, the stuff I'm dealing with in city council and stuff like that, you know, for just quick fighting for the protection of people experiencing homelessness, trying to establish radical solutions that are in other places, but having the entire predominantly white, predominantly wealthy community of Santa Cruz come down on me like a crashing wave of like, wow, you're the most evil person to ever sit in the office of Santa Cruz. And then having a lot of my elders be completely silent in that action and in that reality, not like saying like, hey, yo, how can we like fight this, or how can we support you, or like, what? Look, I'm gonna do this or that, the other thing. So that kind of support. So when things get rough, acknowledging and seeing that things are getting rough, and then not waiting for the youth to ask for help, because sometimes they're caught up in so many other things they don't have time to reach out to every elder and ask them for help, but instead going to them and asking for how you might be able to help them is something that I really appreciate.
If I can address my own question, it's kind of arrogant, but in terms of what I have found that I have needed and still need, first of all, it's a team. To understand the limits of what one person can do. And I really understood that when I became provost, because my job was taught to me, not only by other provosts, but by the staff that I worked with. Because the provosts were academics. And in my case, this was my first administrative position. So I was taught by my secretary, by the academic advisors, by the rest of the staff, the rest of the community of Oaks College, as well as the council of provosts. So I learned something else about teamwork in that particular setting. I had been in other team settings, but this was very, very significant. And as far as the other part of what I do that involves generating certain kinds of work that then has to be sent out into the world, the best way to describe that need comes from 3 words that a writing teacher that I knew of in this community used. and they were patience, persistence, and postage. Because postage now has changed a little bit, but you know what I mean. Moving it off your desk.
All right, so now we'll open it to the greater space. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll walk over with a mic.
Come on, you
All
guys
right,
gonna
you got
have something.
How you doing? Name's Louis Odiase, fourth year business economics major, Oaks College. Hello. So I had a question about kind of our current generation right now. It's just something that's kind of been plaguing me for like the last couple months specifically. So as you know, as you've seen our generation, you've seen like our hip hop music, you've seen our, toxic masculinity, everything. So what do you think was like kind of like the main catalyst that kind of resulted in this change? So coming from like the 1960s, 1970s, everything was about empowering Black people, and then there's kind of like a switch or like a kind of a gradual change to where we are now, where that's not really our main focus anymore. It's more about it need to be entertainment, kind of getting big in any different aspect, but mostly entertainment. So I want to know like what like made our focus kind of switch. Is it because racism started to become more subtle? As in, you have like the prison industrial complex, instead of like straight Jim Crow, you have these other kind of different forms of racism, which makes it seem like it's not even there anymore. So I want to know like what do you think was like the main change for us as like Black people to like stop pushing as we were before?
Do you really want one of us old heads to deal with that question? One way to address that question is to sit up and binge watch music videos. Go back to the beginning of the music video and look at what was presented. Look at the scenes that were presented and look at how they have evolved. And the power of that imagery. What's the relationship between the power of that imagery and, on the one hand, the decay to which it is responding, but on the other hand, the messages that one can enrich oneself in the midst of that decay by marketing certain kinds of images. And we have always had these kinds of conflicting images. We've always had images of pimps who were successful. We've always had images of underworld figures who many people would admire because they succeeded, however success was going to be understood. So I think it's a very complicated question, but I would say from the standpoint of someone who grew up during the 1960s, and I say grew up because I was a kid, so I'm not going to say that I was out here doing this, that, and the other thing. I was born in 1952, so I was only 8 years old in 1960, but that meant that by the end of the 1960s, I was well into the beginning of my adulthood. There were deliberate efforts to interrupt the processes, the social processes that were undertaken in the 1960s and 70s. And if you studied this from the late 60s with COINTELPRO and what it did with regard to the Black movement, to the Black Panther Party, to others, to nationalists, and to the anti-war movement, and that entire culture that had been created that was called the counterculture. It was a counterculture to oppressive, racist, sexist, patriarchal capitalism. That was beginning to change people's minds, and it started at the confluence of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Both of those movements being brought into people's homes every day and every night with the 6 o'clock news. So that it became important to interrupt that, interrupt those patterns, interrupt the organization. The music that went with those struggles was the popular music of its time. But the words were being changed by the people who were in the streets. And they were not always doing the same thing in the streets, but they were always risking their lives. And so, if you look at the transition that occurs between the late 60s and the early 70s, when you move from the organization, the breakfast programs, the awareness of the needs of inner city people, the recognition of poor people wherever they were. Don't forget, Dr. King was killed in the midst of a poor people's campaign. He was in the midst of fighting for sanitation workers. That was a grassroots movement. If you think about that, and then you go fast forward to Superfly, only a few years later, that didn't just happen. And I'm not saying that everything has to be looked at in terms of conspiracies, because that makes us into sheep. But we do allow ourselves to be manipulated by the power of the images that we see. And those images help to define us and to limit us. And then hurt people hurt people.
So just to compare for a younger generation, I would say in my personal experience, the studying I've done on the shift in the culture from the 60s and 70s, Dr. Anthony, he spoke to the 60s and the 70s, and then he kind of left it out there. The 80s, I think we all know the crack revolution. For the most part, and most black people in this room, we're the fallout of the crack era. We're crack babies for the most part. I was born in '92. So one thing that I feel as if has necessarily caused a change, other than the obvious, instantiation of, large amounts of drugs in the neighborhoods, is what comes with those drugs. So hip hop and music that black people, specifically in Americas, have used, and I actually learned this specifically from Dr. Anthony's class, for the most part, it's bred out of pain, for the most part. You go back to Negro spirituals during slavery, and then we actually followed through jazz music and how the dialect and like the idea that black people, we have this separate dialect that we use, jive or whatever it may be. I think that as you follow this trend along, black people, we've, in this country specifically, born arts out of necessity almost. Some of the most beautiful art that we've experienced has come from pain. Some of the most beautiful music is bred from pain. And the shift in the culture has directly correlated with the shift in the reality that has faced black communities. If you watch any NWA interview, Ice Cube will talk about it directly. We're speaking to what's happening in our community directly. Now, when you mix that in with the powers that be, it's pretty clear to, accept the idea that, as you push forward into generations, the powers that be that fight against us, they have to shift as well, right? So the way in which they shift, Dr. Anthony alluded to, in the changing of the music, in the advent of technology, we have so much access to this. It's shifted our perspective from that of an internal to an external one, in which the things we see are what we embody. But at the same time, it's a circular process that seemingly doesn't necessarily have an end, because it's born out of pain. Then hurt people watch these hurt things, and then we replicate it and we duplicate it, and it continues. So I personally feel as if the shift is directly correlated with crack, in all honesty. I think we underestimate the fallout of crack and what it genuinely has and how it has affected our community. And we're listening to music that is born from a bunch of children who didn't have fathers, who grew up in crack-infested communities. So they're making music about what they saw.
And I think that's why it's so important to study history, I always stress this with people, study history, because if you understand history, then all of it makes sense. And it's kind of like, oh, that's why. But if you don't understand history, and you're trying to explain to someone all of the connections from slavery to the desegregation, but to Jim Crow laws, to the 70s and 80s black liberation movements, to the 80s where they introduced crack into neighborhoods, to the restructuring of media and media outlets, to now where the Southern strategy of the Southern states, if you understand the Southern strategy and how that impacted the voting rights of the South and the continued dismantling of the voting rights movement, or the Voting Rights Act, I should say. If you try and explain that to everyone, to someone in one sitting, they're going to call you crazy or a conspiracy theorist or saying you're reading too much into it or that you're being too sensitive. And this is another reason why when people say, well, my parents didn't own slaves, that you have to realize that they're coming from a place of just so much misinformation and disconnection that they're not going to get it unless they spend a week straight reading history. And that's where we're running into some of the hardest problems, because we're trying to educate people over the internet, like in conversations on Facebook and all these other kinds of things, and they're coming into the conversation with no context at all about what's going on. So to the brother in the back that asked the question, my short answer is what caused the shift is black liberation and empowerment. Because as soon as there was the realization that there was black liberation and empowerment, and as soon as they realized that poor people across races were about to get together and cause a movement that would transform the country, they put all of their minds in one room and said, how are we going to dismantle this and slow it down? And that's exactly what they've been doing for the last 50 years, and they're going to continue to keep doing it, which is how we have the president in the presidency right now. The reason we have that is because of the misinformation over generations, because of the abuse of power and the concentrated and intentional destruction of black power, black and brown power in the United States.
I'll say something about music.
Do you want to have one more? Maybe.
Is it time? Okay, I just wanted to just put my 2 cents in about the music thing. When I came here, well, let me see. I left Butte County from a black ghetto, a rural ghetto, and moved into Albany, into the projects, and then Oakland. And you could always, well, I don't know about Orville, but in Oakland, Berkeley, there were stations, KSAN, KDIA, Rhythm and Blues, that's what they called it at the time. Then I came here 50 years ago, there was a station in Sand City for a while, but you couldn't get a soul song. It just wasn't here until the internet, and you could get on the internet and go to those oldies but goldies. So as far as, I can't remember the name of that movie, but they were kind of the avant-garde of the hip-hop. It was a freedom to say what they thought, how they felt, and there was a big, giant reaction to it. Now, I'm too old to kind of remember when that happened. I was just too old, but it just showed me how that freedom to express yourself when you don't have to worry about, hey, you know, I might get lynched, I might get beat up, I might get fired. Well, I think that was part of what kind of brought about that hip hop movement, because they were able to express themselves without fear.
Hey everybody, my name is Lindsay. I'm a third-year transfer student, legal studies major, also from New York, born in Washington Heights, and all my family's still out there in Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. So it's really good to hear some other perspectives. I guess on a broader scale, my question is, what does dismantling the patriarchy in the Afro community look like to you? And how would you imagine empowering Black women might empower and liberate people of the diaspora as a whole?
Well, they say women's issues are everyone's issues, right? So it's something that pertains to the entire community. Also, I always try and shift whenever I'm speaking about trying to shift the verbiage. So instead of empowering Black women, creating space for them to use their power, because Black women are inherently powerful on their own and they don't need Black men to do anything to empower them, but instead provide a space for them to exert their own power, which already exists. And to do that, I think it's working at the young age, like starting early education. That's my answer for almost everything, is to start intentional education at a young age where they're being taught not only the relationships between the male and female gender in the binary systems of our larger society, but then also understanding the concept of two-spirit or transgender or non-binary or all these other kinds of ideas or identifications or identities, because then as they're growing up in their realm, they're able to take that and implement it in their lives. Also, to work with the elders working with the young kids if they can understand that concept, because as we talked about before, people are coming at it from a whole bunch of different perspectives, and some elders may be totally about that and others may not, which because of the history of toxic masculinity in those communities. So early education, having open and honest dialogue, encouraging vulnerability, I think is key too, because in the ability for a Black man to acknowledge the pain and frustration that he's experiencing inside himself and do something to exert that, whether it be crying, whether it be getting into some kind of martial arts class, whether it be therapy, whether it be meditation, that will open the space in his heart and his mind to be able to be more understanding and receptive, empathetic, loving, and open to then providing and creating that space in the male-dominated world for Black women to exert their own power.
Come on, y'all, you got some Black men up here who want to give you some information. Come on, you got to ask the questions, though.
I think that that's a very important question. It's a very big question, but I think the patriarchy is being dismantled. You know, I don't think it's always evident because the same backward dummies still stand up and say the same backward things. But if you look at the movements, if you look at a movement like Black Lives Matter, you will see the dismantling of the patriarchy. And I think that, you know, I've been very fortunate to have been part of a community that started off in Seaside called the Breakthrough Men's Community, which was actually a community that took inspiration from the women's movement. And that really helped recalibrate the men, and it is still going on. In fact, it has expanded. We've got satellites in Scotts Valley and other places. There are lots of places where men have been re-socialized. Men have begun to think differently. And I think it's very, very challenging for Black men because of the many ways in which negation sometimes has led to overcompensation and hypermasculinity. And it's a very complicated thing. You know, my father was outwardly very, very macho, but that was a shell. That was his armor. And I was fortunate enough to see something else, that he could cry, that he was very affectionate, he was very loving. He held me, he kissed me, he told me he loved me all the time. So when I think about masculinity, I think about the entire range of emotions that were modeled by my father. And yes, I have to also think about his father, who was not like that. Not like that with his children, but then he was like it with his grandchild. And Bill Cosby, before he got into terrible trouble and his name became an epithet, used to tell a story about his father and really how hard his father was and how his children only saw him as a grandfather. And he would say, "You don't understand. That's not the man who raised me. This is a man now who wants to get into heaven." And there's a little bit of that about my grandfather. The stories that I heard about my grandfather when he was rough and tough, I could still see when he was older. But fortunately, I was able to see something else. And I think many of us, if we have an opportunity to develop ourselves, our whole selves, and not only as warriors all the time, not only as tough all the time, not only as hard all the time, then you can see something else.
I think it's a little funny. You had a bipartite question, but you can actually have a singular answer. And I actually think the first part of your question delves into the second part. I think breaking down the patriarchy, in part what it looks like, is infusing our women in understanding that our women are an integral part of us moving forward as a people. So, and then, yeah, so I would actually think the questions kind of merge together. But in terms of how our women, or the way in which our women can impact us, I think a large thing that we need to understand within the community, while men absolutely have the largest job when it comes to elevating our women up, because we've been the largest proponents of pushing our women down for so very long, I think we also have to analyze and understand the impact that the Black woman psychologically has had in regards to their own perception. And by this I mean, I was raised in an all-female household. I'm a male, I'm sometimes the youngest male, the youngest kid, and I'm a male. And my mother, as beautiful as a woman she is, she knew the type of environment that I was raised in, and she knew she had to raise a warrior. And one thing that I realized with a lot of my friends that grew up in situations like that, with just femininity in the household and predominantly Black violent communities, is there is an aspect of womanhood that imposes onto their young men what they believe a man should be. And that, with my specific example, my mother would, my sisters, I have two older sisters that are beautiful, and they would always be out and, so-and-so touched their butt or something like that. And me being the youngest, they'd run back and, "Oh, Najee, you gotta come fight, because so-and-so called me this or did this." And my older sister is 4 years older than me. The one in the middle is 2 years older than me. So I was always fighting older, bigger kids. And I was always like, man, I don't want to do this, I'd cry and all this. And my mother would actually come get me. She said, "No, I'm not raising no punk. I'm not gonna raise no punk. You ain't gonna be no punk. You ain't gonna get punked out here." And I'm using specific language, but believe me when I say it was a lot more vibrant language than that. And so I'm not saying that's consistent with all Black women by any means whatsoever, or trying at all to say, Black women are the causation or anything like that. But I do think as we move forward and we understand that a part of breaking down the patriarchy is integrating our women into movements and respecting them, I think Black women themselves, especially Black women raising single Black boys without another male presence in the house, you need to analyze the way in which they're doing so, and to not impose this concept of this strong Black man and integrating it automatically with violence or anti-homosexuality, because in the same way you grew up in a pro-homosexuality household, unfortunately my mother was the exact opposite. When I'd cry, I'm not going to raise no F word, or I'm not going to raise no punk, and you're going to go fight. So it's a duality to it that I think needs to be recognized as well amongst Black women.
Incredibly powerful. I know that we're running out of time, so if we want to continue this at an informal over the rest of the refreshments, you want to, Abel, do you want to?
Yeah.
I'll wrap it up.
Just a really quick announcement while I have the microphone before everyone scatters and leaves. I I've created an internship structure at the City Hall for my city council office. Before, there was no structured internship structure, and one thing that I really want to encourage is Black students to come and intern with me at City Hall so that we can bring y'all's representation and perspective into policy craft and analysis of the government system in Santa Cruz. They'll be every quarter for 10 weeks, and you can get credit through your legal studies, your political studies, your environmental studies, and your digital art and media studies. So please contact me if you're interested in becoming an intern so that we can bring this mindset of positive social change and Blackness into the Santa Cruz city government.
Thank you everyone for coming. Before we end, if Jason, you could start it in one sentence, finish the sentence. I see myself, as a Black man, I see myself play this role in one sentence. And if we could finish it, that'd be it.
Oh wow, I wish you wouldn't have started with me first. Can you repeat that sentence?
As a Black man, I see myself play this role in my community. In one sentence or two.
I see myself playing a, generally just a role model, someone that the youth can look up to.
I play the role of a socio-psychological developer of young Black men.
I share something that someone once said to me. I have 2 ears and 1 mouth.
I play the role of a change mentor, change maker, mentor, role model, and courageous leader.
I see myself as, I think the most valuable thing I have is my honesty. Everybody I know, they say, well, I can trust you with my paycheck and my daughter. I really feel that being honest and having integrity, that's how I see myself. And I don't like pride, but I just feel like that is my asset. Those are my assets.
And I see myself as a student and my brothers and sisters keeper, and that will do it for today. So thank you everyone.